Go to your closet, pull out any pair of shoes, hold them sole to sole. Look at the shape. The left shoe curves one way, the right shoe curves the other. They're mirror images, distinct, unmistakable. You couldn't wear the left shoe on the right foot without immediate discomfort. You couldn't confuse them in the dark. The leftness of the left shoe and the rightness of the right shoe are so fundamental to what a shoe is that imagining it otherwise feels like imagining a world where gloves don't have fingers. The distinction feels ancient, obvious, inevitable. As if shoes have always been this way because feet have always been this way, and only a fool would make two identical shoes for two different feet. And until approximately 1850, every shoemaker in the Western world was that fool. For the entire history of shoemaking, from the earliest known footwear, roughly 10,000 years ago, through the mid-19th century, shoes were made on straight lasts, symmetrical, identical, no left, no right, the same shoe for both feet, every cobbler, every culture, every century. The shoe that went on your left foot was identical to the shoe that went on your right foot. They were called straights, and they were the only shoes that existed for the overwhelming majority of the time that humans have been wearing shoes. I need you to sit with the strangeness of that, because your immediate reaction, the reaction that everyone has when they first encounter this fact, is to assume that straight shoes must have been uncomfortable. That people before 1850 simply endured poorly fitting footwear because they hadn't figured out something obvious. That the introduction of left and right shoes was a straightforward improvement, a correction of a primitive oversight, progress, and the deeper I went, the more that assumption collapsed. This raises a simple but critical question. If straight shoes were so obviously inferior, why did every shoemaker in every culture on Earth make them for 10,000 years? The official explanation is technology. The tools and techniques required to produce asymmetric lasts, the wooden foot forms around which shoes are constructed, were more complex than those required for symmetric lasts. Making one last is easier than making two mirror image lasts. The economics of pre-industrial shoemaking favored the simpler approach. Cobblers made straight shoes because straight shoes were cheaper and easier to produce. The feet adapted. People broke in their shoes. The leather conformed to the foot over time. It wasn't ideal, but it was practical. And this explanation contains a truth. Asymmetric lasts are more complex to produce. The economics of pre-industrial craft production did favor simplicity, but the explanation assumes that the shoemakers of 10,000 years were solving the wrong problem, that they were optimizing for production ease rather than foot health, that they didn't notice, across 100 centuries of daily practice, that feet are asymmetric and that shoes might benefit from matching that asymmetry. The assumption is absurd. Shoemakers spent their entire lives studying feet, measuring feet, fitting leather to feet. The medieval cobbler knew the shape of the human foot more intimately than any modern podiatrist because the cobbler's livelihood depended on producing footwear that his customers would wear and return for. A cobbler who produced uncomfortable shoes didn't survive in the market. The idea that 10,000 years of professional shoemakers simply failed to notice that feet have different shapes is not a historical argument. It's an insult to the intelligence of every craftsperson who ever cut leather. The deeper I went into the pre-1850 shoemaking tradition, the more I found that straight shoes weren't a compromise. They were a choice, a deliberate, informed, medically grounded choice based on an understanding of the foot that the modern shoe industry has overwritten. The silence was deafening. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Start with what the straight shoe actually did to the foot, because this is where the modern assumption of discomfort meets the historical reality of function. The straight last produces a shoe with a wide, symmetrical toe box. No curve, no narrowing toward the outside, no channeling of the toes into an asymmetric point. The toes in a straight shoe spread naturally. They splay. They occupy the full width of the shoe without being pushed inward by a curved last that directs the big toe toward the midline and compresses the small toes toward the outside. Now look at the shape of a modern left shoe. Look at the sole. The toe box curves inward toward the big toe side. The curve follows the assumption that the foot is shaped like the shoe, narrowing toward the toes, curving inward at the ball. The modern shoe doesn't match the natural shape of the foot. It matches the shape that feet develop after years of wearing modern shoes. The curve in the shoe creates the curve in the foot. The shoe trains the foot into its own shape, and then the shape of the trained foot is used as evidence that the shoe's shape was correct all along. Pull up photographs of feet from populations that don't wear modern shoes, indigenous populations, barefoot communities, historical photographs of people who grew up in straight-lasted shoes or no shoes at all. Look at the shape of their feet. The toes are splayed. The big toe points straight forward, not inward. The foot is wider at the toes than at the heel. The natural human foot doesn't look like a modern shoe. It looks like a straight shoe, wide, symmetrical, toes spread. The deeper I went into the podiatric research, the more I found that the asymmetric modern shoe doesn't accommodate the natural foot. It deforms it. The modern left shoe pushes the big toe inward. This inward pressure, sustained over years of daily wear from childhood onward, produces hallux valgus. Bunions, the most common foot deformity in the industrialized world, affecting an estimated 1 in 3 adults in shoe-wearing populations, virtually absent in barefoot and straight shoe populations. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every foot pathology that modern podiatry treats as common. Hammer toes, caused by toe compression in narrow, curved toe boxes. Morton's neuroma, caused by compression of the metatarsal heads in shoes that narrow where the foot widens. Plantar fasciitis, exacerbated by rigid arch supports that prevent the natural flexion of the foot's plantar structures. Ingrown toenails, caused by lateral pressure on the nail bed from shoes that compress the toes. Each condition is treated as a medical problem. Each is treated with orthotics, surgery, medication. Each is epidemic in shoe-wearing populations and rare or absent in populations that wear straight shoes or no shoes. The foot pathologies that sustain the modern podiatric and orthotic industries are caused by the modern shoe. And the modern shoe, the asymmetric shoe, the left and right shoe, was introduced in approximately 1850. Here's where the timeline becomes critical. Because the introduction of left and right shoes didn't happen gradually. It happened during a specific period, driven by a specific technological change that had nothing to do with foot health and everything to do with industrial production. The 1850s saw the industrialization of shoemaking, the introduction of machine production, the replacement of the individual cobbler who crafted shoes by hand on lasts shaped for specific customers, with the factory, which produced shoes on standardized lasts for mass distribution. The factory needed standardization. It needed sizing systems. It needed interchangeable parts and predictable outputs. And it needed left and right shoes, not because the foot demanded them, because the factory demanded them. The straight last, the symmetric shoe that had served every foot for 10,000 years, was incompatible with the industrial sizing system that the factory required. The industrial system needed discrete sizes. It needed standardized shapes. It needed shoes that could be produced in volume and sold without fitting because the factory couldn't fit shoes to individual feet the way the cobbler could. The cobbler's straight shoe worked because the cobbler adjusted the leather to the foot during construction and during subsequent visits. The factory shoe couldn't be adjusted. It had to fit out of the box, and fitting out of the box required a shape that matched the foot closely enough to be wearable without customization. The asymmetric last was the factory's solution to the factory's problem. Not the foot's problem, the factory's problem. The problem of producing shoes at industrial scale for feet that had never been measured by the people making the shoes. The left-right distinction was introduced to compensate for the loss of the craftsman's individual attention. The curve in the shoe replaced the cobbler's hands. The asymmetry was a substitute for skill. The deeper I went into the industrial history of shoemaking, the more the introduction of left and right shoes looked less like an improvement and more like a compromise. A compromise that traded the wide, natural, foot-shaped space of the straight shoe for a narrower, curved, machine-shaped space that was easier to manufacture but harder on the foot. The straight shoe was better for the foot. The asymmetric shoe was better for the factory, and the factory won. Here's where the medical consequences become impossible to ignore, because the introduction of the asymmetric shoe in the mid-1800s corresponds precisely to the emergence of foot pathologies that had been rare or unknown before. Go look at the medical literature on bunions. The first significant medical descriptions of hallux valgus as a common condition appear in the mid to late 1800s. Before that, the condition existed but was rare enough that it didn't warrant extensive medical discussion. Within a few decades of the introduction of mass-produced asymmetric shoes, bunions became epidemic. The medical profession responded not by questioning the shoe but by developing surgical procedures to correct the deformity the shoe created. The first bunionectomy techniques were developed in the late 1800s. An entire surgical subspecialty was born from a foot problem that the industrial shoe produced. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every foot-related medical specialty that emerged in the century following the introduction of asymmetric shoes: podiatry, orthotics, pedorthics, foot surgery. Each discipline treats conditions that are epidemic in populations wearing modern shoes and rare in populations that don't. Each discipline generates revenue from conditions that the industrial shoe created. Each discipline's existence depends on the continued production of shoes that deform the feet that the discipline then treats. And here's the thread that connects the shoe to everything else I've investigated. Because the straight shoe wasn't just a shoe, it was a relationship between the foot and the ground. A relationship mediated by minimal material, shaped to accommodate the natural foot rather than to reshape it. The straight shoe let the foot be a foot. Let the toes spread. Let the arch flex. Let the sole feel the ground through leather that was thin enough to transmit sensory information and flexible enough to allow natural movement. The modern asymmetric shoe does the opposite. It constrains the toes. It rigidifies the arch. It cushions the sole to the point where ground feel is eliminated. It reshapes the foot to match the shoe rather than shaping the shoe to match the foot. And it does this from childhood, from the first pair of shoes strapped onto a toddler's feet, from the first moment that the developing foot encounters the asymmetric curve that will, over years of sustained pressure, deform the bones, compress the nerves, and produce the pathologies that the medical industry will later treat as normal. The deeper I went, the more the 1850 transition started to look like the same pattern I've found in every investigation. A natural system, the straight shoe that accommodated the natural foot, replaced by an industrial system, the asymmetric shoe that accommodated the factory. The replacement producing pathologies, the pathologies producing industries, the industries defending the system that produces the pathologies, and the original system, the one that worked for 10,000 years without producing the conditions that now affect 1 in 3 adults, buried so thoroughly that suggesting a return to it sounds like regression rather than recovery. Here's what the cobbler knew that the factory forgot. The foot isn't asymmetric in the way the modern shoe assumes. The foot is dynamic. It changes shape under load. It spreads when it bears weight. It narrows when it lifts. The toes splay on contact and converge on release. The arch flexes and extends with every step. The foot is not a static shape that a shoe must match. It's a moving structure that a shoe must accommodate. And a straight shoe, with its wide toe box and its symmetric form, accommodates movement. It gives the foot room to be a foot. The asymmetric shoe, with its curved last and its narrow toe box, constrains movement. It gives the foot room to be a shoe. I'm not telling you to wear identical shoes on both feet. 10,000 years of straight shoes worked because those shoes were handmade by craftsmen who fitted them to individual feet through skill and experience. You can't replicate that with mass-produced straights from a factory. But I'm asking why the widest, most natural, most foot-shaped shoe in history was replaced by a narrower, more constrictive, more deforming shoe at the exact moment when shoemaking moved from the craftsman to the factory. I'm asking why the foot pathologies that now affect hundreds of millions of people worldwide appeared in the medical literature at the exact moment when the straight shoe was replaced by the asymmetric shoe. I'm asking why an industry that generates billions of dollars annually treating foot deformities has never questioned whether the shoes its customers wear might be causing the deformities it treats. I'm asking what your feet would look like if you'd spent your life in shoes shaped like feet instead of feet shaped like shoes. Go take your shoes off. Look at your feet. Look at your big toe. Is it pointing straight forward or angling inward toward the other toes? Look at your small toes. Are they straight or curled? Look at the width of your foot at the toes compared to the width at the heel. Is your foot wider at the toes, the way a natural foot should be? Or has it been narrowed by decades of compression into a shape that matches the shoe rather than the skeleton? Your feet are the shape of your shoes. They were supposed to be the shape of your feet.